Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute's Climate and Water Program, and I welcome you to our final event for the program ahead of and leading up to COP28, which is merely weeks away. And today we're going to be discussing a number of critical issues that I think will be relevant and come to a head at COP28 as world leaders, experts, policymakers, negotiators, and activists, and those that are involved and affected by the climate crisis will come together in Dubai to address the current and projected consequences of a rapidly warming climate and what we can do about it. Before I begin with formal introductions, I just want to take a personal note and say that I would be remiss to not mention my personal grief, horror, and extreme disappointment with what is happening in Gaza. And I desperately hope that we can bring to a swift end all the unnecessary loss of lives for all those affected. With that, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists that will help us discuss today's various topics related to COP28 and climate crisis as it is to date. I'll be very brief with their very accomplished biographies, just to give more time for our discussion. So this by no means minimizes their very, very accomplished careers to date. But first, I'd like to introduce Aisha Saihi, who is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute. Not to be confused with this Middle East Institute, this is a joke her and I have laughed about previously, but a different Middle East Institute. And her areas of research expertise and interests include clean energy policy, climate economics, policies and governance with a focus on the Arab region. And she's also held other affiliate research fellow positions with other think tanks across the world. Next, we have Essam Haggi, who is the Chief Scientist and Research Director of the Earth Science Program at the Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute, which is under the umbrella of the Hamad bin Khalifa University. He's also a research scientist at the Viterbi School of Engineering in the University of Southern California, and is an affiliate of the Radar Science and Engineering Section, NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. As you'll see, the focus seems to look towards space, but he's very much a water person at heart as well, which will be part of our discussion today. And then also with us is Laurent Lambert, who's a faculty at the School of Economics, Administration, and Public Policy of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar, and Sciences Po Paris in France. And Laurent has been working as a sustainable development researcher, a project and program manager, consultant, and government advisor in the fields of international risks, public policy, and conflicts with several governments and international organizations over the course of his 15-plus year career. And he's dabbled quite often in issues of water and climate. And he's a geographer, so by nature, he tends to touch on all these very subjects. So we'll draw on that today. So those, as brief as I could make introductions. And before we start a discussion, one housekeeping note is for our audience who'd like to submit questions, please feel free to do that via the Q&A function in Zoom. And I will, as they come in and where appropriate, I will try to incorporate your questions during our panel discussion. So with that out the way, we have a lot to discuss, so let's just jump right into it. And I'm going to categorically move through themes. And I think the first theme I want to address is related to sort of the trajectory of climate change. And this year particularly has been exceptional in terms of the record-breaking summer that we saw with really extreme daily temperatures. And then that even led post the summer, these last several months, significantly warmer than average temperatures as well. And I believe last I checked, and others on the panel may correct me once we start talking about it, hasn't been confirmed as far as I know, but we're almost but confirmed. It feels that 2023 is very likely going to be the hottest year on record to date, which is extraordinary. But we've all felt it this year in terms of how extreme the temperatures were. So I pose this question to the panel from your perspective of how this year went in terms of climate change and the extremes that we've experienced. what's the significance of that moving forward? And we'll focus, we can focus specifically on the MENA region, but also have a global context. But I really want to set that stage for our discussion for all the things that will come next in our conversation. But Essam, I'll pose this question to you first, and then others in our panel can chime in as they feel necessary.
So the answer to that is that climate change is not just 1 degree above the average temperature. It's not about just feeling hot. Just to make it very simple to the audience who are with us, if your body temperature increase by 1 degree, you feel headache, you're tired, your system, your whole body as a human will behave differently. So this 1 degree should not be perceived as just an adjustment to your air condition. It just means that the whole Earth system will behave in unpredictable way, with more extreme events, with more heat waves, with more flash rains, with more storms, and all of that, we don't know where it will hit and how it will hit. And let's not forget that a month and a half ago, 11,000 people, they died in the desert of Libya from flooding. And so we can think that people will die in the desert missing water. Here we died by the excess of water. And so that's what this 1 degree means. It means a whole change in the Earth system that goes beyond the readiness of the current infrastructure we have.
Thanks, Essam. Laurent or Aisha, do you want to add a few points? Yeah. Laurent, maybe first.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think what has been said is very appropriate, understanding that what may seem to be a small increase in temperature is actually changing the system. And that's what is important. And here I would like to add something, which is that the 1 degree increase is an average at the global scale. However, it doesn't happen as a 1 degree everywhere at the same time. And now we need to understand that this temperature is energy. And this 1 degree at the global scale means an incredible amount of energy which has been added to the system. And the system is, if you want, not working as it used to because it has a vast amount of energy in addition to what it used to have. So if you try any device you have home to increase vastly the electricity amount you give to it, you're gonna destroy it. Our system, our environmental system, and especially our climate system is not destroyed, but it's disrupted. And this disruption, as Essam just said, comes in the form of extreme meteorological events. More floods, more destructive floods, more tropical cyclones, which can be called somewhere, in some areas can be called severe, tropical storms, but it happens to be cyclones which can destroy vast areas where these cyclones used to be unknown or poorly known or rarely known, and now it comes more often. So this is something, for instance, not far from the Middle East in the North Indian Ocean, where there is a big concern because of the increase and new geography of tropical cyclones. And let's keep in mind also, just would like to say one thing, that the more we have this heat in our global system, the more also our oceans, are hotter and thus take more volume. And this leads to sea level rise, which is a big concern all around the world, including in the Middle East.
Yeah, agreed on both counts. Okay, I think we've set the stage there in terms of what it means currently and moving forward. So maybe Aisha will shift into a conversation of climate mitigation. So if that's what we're dealing with, let's look at maybe what we can do about it. So one of the tracks certainly is climate mitigation, probably the most prevalent track. And we know, as we said, COP28 is very much on the horizon, and several very important key items will be part of that agenda. One of those is really a process that started at COP26 and will conclude at COP28 after the 2-year process, which is the global stocktake. And given that the global stocktake is really going to establish a new benchmark in terms of the current gap between global mitigation efforts and the goals of the Paris Agreement in terms of curbing the impact of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. Based on that, what do you think the future of mitigation and energy transition efforts in the region, specifically the Middle East and North Africa, will look like?
Thank you very much, Mohammed, and thanks for having me. First of all, I would like also to build on the previous question and then go on the global stocktake. So also for the global stocktake, there already has been released a technical dialogue report, synthesis report by the UNFCCC in September this year, just ahead the COP28. And the report highlighted that the global surface temperature already risen by 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. And the report already has shown that there's a discrepancy between where the climate, what the climate says, and where our current climate policies are. The report shows that the current climate pledges are going to lead to 2.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius rise in the temperature by the end of the century. And this is beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal that we are trying to keep within reach. And to actually, the report also suggests that we have the opportunity to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. And for that, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030. And so the global stocktake, well, we also need to understand what it is. And we also need to wait whether it will be a successful mechanism during the COP or not. And of course, this is the challenge for the UAE. So the global stocktake is a mechanism developed by the UNFCCC to assess the collective progress of countries on their, achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, where the countries stand today and where they need to be. So, and the global stocktake has already started, as you mentioned, in COP26 and 2021. And there it has been in two phases. Phase one, the technical dialogue, and the second technical dialogue also happened this year as well. So at COP28, there will be the final phase for the global stocktake, which is the political phase. And the political phase is where the countries decide on their position, on the outcomes of the synthesis report. And the success of this final stage of global stocktake will translate into outcomes that will be included in the COP cover decision. So whether it's successful or not, going back to your question on the implications of it to the energy transition in the MENA region, I think the momentum for the energy transition in the MENA region has already taken place. I don't think it's going to be going back or take a U-turn. A few years ago, we wouldn't see much of implications of renewable energy technologies in the region. But today, the installed capacity of renewable energy has increased in many countries in the MENA region, which is, of course, a diverse region. It has countries with, diverse economic size and also natural resources. But for the Gulf region, for example, the installed capacity for renewable energy is visible. It has increased up to 4,000 watts by and then see a growing ambitions to also develop that. So, and also we have seen climate diplomacy engagement from the region. Egypt has hosted the COP last year. The UAE is hosting the COP. The MENA Climate Week has already been hosted twice in the region, and that has created, kind of a spillover in terms of the ending change as well as the solutions that need to address the climate change. It raised the awareness among different sectors in the society, the government.
We lost you momentarily, I think, with the internet connection, but we see you now. You were talking about climate diplomacy, and then you disconnected. So if you want to carry your thought from there.
Yeah, so I'm back. So yes, so I was just saying that the awareness and also the willingness to act on the climate is now among the different sectors of the society. The private sector is getting involved. Also the civil society is also getting involved. The media is helping to raise awareness about the climate change, and the host of these events have really have the spillover in terms, raising the awareness, even among nothing about the climate change or their, for example, their job climate change. Now they know COP, then that's curiosity, what is COP and what is our targets. Now visiting the Middle, you speak to the people what climate change is, that we see of the past. It has been something within the scientist groups or researchers, but not pretty much within the different groups in the society.
Yeah. Aisha, I'm so sorry, your internet keeps cutting out. We keep losing your audio in and out. Maybe if you want to reset your internet, I'll move on to another panelist, give you time to kind of maybe reset for the following questions, because it keeps cutting in and out.
Mohammed, if I may jump in,
Sure.
Building upon what Aisha has just said about the COPs and the history of the COPs taking place in the Middle East. 10 years ago, there was climate negotiations in Qatar. And what a number of people don't know is that this is when, in Qatar, was renewed the Kyoto Protocol. So this is not a small thing. This was very important because this was before there was the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And so the Kyoto Protocol was this infrastructure that was in place, the only one really, to make sure that there was a mechanism for many countries to collaborate and have targets to decrease their emissions of greenhouse gases, especially industrial economies of Europe, Japan, and a few others. Now, I totally agree with what Aisha was saying, that we have a momentum here in the region, which is very interesting. We have a strong desire. Some people doubt about the UAE leadership being truthful in its intentions to deliver, because it's an oil and gas exporting country. But they don't understand that the UAE is first and foremost a set of cities built on either islands or coastlines, which are low-lying coastlines, and that they are at risk of what we were mentioning just before, sea level rise. And that's pretty much like some places in the northeast of the US or in, I think, Florida, you have great risks coming from the sea if climate change continues unabated. So this is why the UAE for more than 10 years have actually participated very actively in the climate negotiations, because they are very concerned about the climate crisis not being managed properly and climate going unabated in a worsening crisis. So I personally have no doubt that the UAE leadership is looking forward to dealing with the climate crisis, with the climate governance. Now, the only question is what role for, of course, the oil, the gas in the future energy mix. And this is the big question mark. But I think this is what we're going to see in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I'm going to ask, your discussion point has brought a different question to mind that I kind of want to pause it sideways, which is this idea that, you know, I think this year has been a disruptor in so many ways, obviously not just the climate impacts, but I think our plan globally or even regionally trajectory of dealing with climate change, because just prior to this summer, and if we look at the very beginning of the year, I recall, I think it was the WMO had said that one of the next, I forget it was in 5 or 10 years, one of the next very upcoming years in the short term is going to be the new hottest year on record. And just before that, we had, to Aisha's point, I think, concluded the 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC, which had set the plans and sort of the analysis of the previous few years. And I think, number one, I don't think most of us anticipated that the first year in the next several years that the WMO posited what like 2023 is going to look like, being the hottest year on record. And then the shift, you know, does it looks different to compare to what some of the suggestions coming out of the IPCC report, because I think this year was just such a shift compared to where we were in the last few years. So this is kind of an observation, but maybe a question to you all is that's connected to the question I asked, but what does that mean? I mean, we've shifted so much. This year is sort of, I wouldn't say it's an outlier, it could very well be a paradigm shift of things to come, but it's made everything else that we planned for a little bit off, because I think it shifted. So I don't know, Aslam, maybe you want to respond to that. You're on mute.
So yes, many thanks, Mohammed. I want to weigh in that. Very important. The perception for climate change. I am a scientist, so I work on science data, observation, and model, and I'm deep into this, understanding the impact of climate change in the physical impact in hyper-arid region, including, of course, the Middle East and the southwest of the United States. Now people think the climate change impact are in the future, and this give us like a relaxing feeling. We don't need to worry about it. It's going to resolve itself magically. It will not happen. Maybe the scientists are wrong and all of that. The truth is, the impact of climate change are coming much sooner than we think, because they are worsened by environmental deterioration. Let me give you an example of that. So Laurent explained how sea level rise impact all the Eastern Arabian Peninsula, not only the UAE, impact Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and it causes very rapid shoreline retreat, which means the coastline is going inland. And from 1880 to this day, the coastland in the Eastern Arabian Peninsula, on average, went 1 kilometer inland. What that means is that you are building today in the area that's going to be submerged tomorrow. So you are wasting billions of dollars to build where you should not build. So how these are worsened by environmental mismanagement? We are building large infrastructure on the coastline, which blocks the sediment transport from inland to the coastline. And this sediment transport are what protect the coastline from flooding, from sea level rise. So these big, beautiful, magnificent infrastructure that we see on the coastline, that we show in video clips, and we think it's a sign of our civilization, it's actually a sign that we are accelerating the impact of sea level rise locally, which is called the relative sea level rise. We've seen that in Tunisia, we've seen that in Egypt and the northern delta, and basically in a lot of spots in the Eastern Arabian Peninsula. So it is true that sea level rise, the forecast of sea level rise show that we're going to be 1 meter above the sea level in about 80 years. But we have higher impacts of sea level rise occurring right now from environmental mismanagement. And it's not, and the impact, I mean the shoreline retreat. So it is really happening right now, and we are in the middle of it. And I hope the next COP, will realize the leverage in the Middle East, that the sign of climate change are coming faster due to large-scale environmental mismanagement.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's shift gears. We've touched on climate mitigation, and Aisha laid out for us sort of and Laurent as well, the energy transition piece. Let's talk about climate adaptation, and I'm going to selfishly, this is a question that's dear to me, so I'm going to selfishly pose it, which is also, I see a couple of questions around this in the Q&A, which is related to water on the adaptation side. And that is, from my perspective, I feel that water security has often been relegated as a secondary theme at best at not just COP meetings, but these sort of larger level climate related meetings and discussions. And funny enough, it's second place to things like food security and energy transition, which is very ironic considering that when we think about food security, having reliable and secure water supplies gets you to food security. You cannot have a discussion about sufficient food production, food security, certainly in our region, which is quite arid and dry, the region that we study, without addressing the water issue. And secondary to that, and I know Aisha has expertise in this area, which is when we talk about energy, green hydrogen now is becoming a very large part of the energy transition conversation. And green hydrogen as well is produced and relies on water. It's a process that separation of H2O to get the hydrogen part of the H2O. So that also is reliant on water supply as well. So considering all that, and considering the fact that water resources are quite stressed in the MENA region, how can we elevate the importance of water-related issues to support these other topics and issues which are being focused on in these climate negotiations and discussions to be a premier area of climate adaptation? I think all of us that are familiar with this issue are aware. You know, we all have touched the water issue at some point. We recognize it as the experts, but there's a disconnect, it feels, at the global or large level when we have these larger discussions like the COP meeting, of not giving water its due, because we recognize how important it is for adaptation, food security, and even to a certain extent, energy transition. So maybe, I guess, Assam, I'll pose this to you first, and please all of you chime in as you would like.
Yes, many thanks, Mohammed. I think one of the main reasons water is quite absent in the climate change conference, it's because of the level uncertainty and the rules that exist in the climate sector. It's very different than the one that exists in the water sector. For instance, we have boundary agreements to manage aquifers, the rivers, and we don't have that when it comes to climate really. And water is considered as a resource that is managed with some level of sovereignty by nation, while the climate, there is nobody who would say, I have the climate sovereignty on this atmosphere or on this layer of the atmosphere. So there is a sovereignty and legal issues and different political issues. I believe the part that water is not in the COP, that people did not want to add a worst problem to another one, which is already hot and spicy, so it would become unmanageable. But a part of it now, that the biggest, what is driving the water issues, what is driving today water conflicts, water dispute, it's the climate uncertainty. The problem is not we have too little or too much water. The problem is the uncertainty on the water budget. And to resolve that uncertainty on the water budget, we need to understand the change in climate factor and in climate drivers. And that's what I believe where the present of water should be, that the COP is an excellent opportunity to constrain the ambiguities on the climate driver that governs the water availability.
Aisha, I kind of want to pull you in here and give us the energy perspective on the water side, because it's one that isn't, if we talk little about water, the water energy connection is even feels completely missing in contrast. But what's your perspective on this?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say the UAE COP, because this schedule, the 2-week schedule this year is designed around themes. There's one thematic day that focus on the agriculture, food, and water. And I think because the UAE recognized the importance of addressing the water scarcity in the Middle East, this is why we have one day that focus on this specific topic. And I think also the previous COP, maybe the host countries did not necessarily have a water scarcity issue. Therefore, the water scarcity comes under the general umbrella of adaptation. So the Egypt and the UAE host of the COP have brought the water scarcity to the table again. Now, yes, some also climate solutions will require water, like the hydrogen, the green hydrogen projection in the Middle East. However, the Middle East recognize also that this might be a challenge, and they recognize that they also want to leverage on the hydrocarbon resources. So early stages of the hydrogen production will focus on producing blue hydrogen, which depends on the use of the carbon capture and storage to produce hydrogen from natural gas, for example. And also oil can be used also in association with the carbon capture and storage. For the production of green hydrogen where the water is needed, now this will need innovative solutions. And for example, Saudi Arabia, the NEOM project, they are actually really exploring solutions around the innovative solutions for water production from low carbon resources. Now, I don't have exactly an idea if they have any specific project, but I believe this is one of the focus of the NEOM is to be a sustainable city and also to produce energy from clean energy resources. I think for the MENA region moving forward, because of the water scarcity, and because we will need more water desalination plants, which might not necessarily be a sustainable solution in the long run, what the Middle East countries can focus on is really to think about innovative solutions for water production, apart from the reverse osmosis, but to think about something else. I have been in conversation with colleagues who, we have been talking about the carbon markets and carbon credits. And so there are some few companies have already actually started to think about water credits. So if someone, invest in water-related projects, so they can also get credits for that, similar to the carbon market. So this, of course, these solutions requires everyone to be involved. So we need more of a collaboration and cooperation. And the UAE host of the COP this year recognized the importance of the cooperation. So for the first time, they have opened a green zone. So the green zone is open to anyone who wants to go to the COP and anyone who doesn't have the badge or the accreditation to attend the COP. So this is a kind of also an innovative platform. It is open for the private sector, for the businesses, for the NGOs and the civil society groups to discuss solutions together in not in the formal way that we see in the blue zone, where when the formal negotiations takes place.
That's exactly right. Thank you. That's great. Laurent, you're gonna have to pull you in. You can't have a water question and you not discuss. But I want to, in addition to the main question, I want to throw something your way as well. So we talked about water as a producer, so to speak, producer for food. In this small vein, when we're talking about green hydrogen and what Aisha said is a producer of that, and I like this idea of water markets, right? Water credits, which could be interesting. Let's flip it the other way as well, as the same question, but I want you to consider this: water as a consumer. So in this case, I think in this region, water is a consumer of energy. And we know in the Arabian Peninsula and other parts of the Middle East, desalination is a huge component of water supply portfolio. Just want you to think, I think also one of our questions from the audience is related to that, but not just in terms of how do we elevate water, but also this idea of our reliance on water as a supply and the dependency on desalination in the region. Just something to consider in your response.
Absolutely, you're right. I mean, there are many ways where water, climate, and energy are totally imbricated, and it's why it's so complex also. So just when I was listening to Aisha, I was looking for the many IPCC quotes on the role of water, and I found quotes from 15 years ago where the IPCC was already saying that water is the primary medium via which climate change will affect human societies. And we have forms of these quotes changing just a little over the years in the different IPCC reports. And this is interesting because it is really very often, and I think you were mentioning this earlier on, Mohammed, at odds with what many diplomats or journalists will put forward. Climate change would be about temperature, and it would be, well, sometimes about flood, but this is very often about temperature, and this is about also wildfires increasingly, because this has been in the news. But unfortunately, the role of water has not been, I think, highlighted enough. And this is very important. We have great uncertainty. I think Aisam mentioned it, and it's very important to know it. I used to teach to engineers strategies related to water, and there is a big problem because now when you want to design dams, you don't know sometimes over the decades, the forthcoming decades, how much variation you will have from the decades of data you have in the past, which normally helped you to build the dams, you know, with some margin of errors and so on. But now this is much more difficult. And this is just one of the problems. Some other problems are related to the fact that the way water comes in our societies, in our countries, is much more violent, disrupted, unpredictable. And thus our relationship to water, which is the basis of civilizations, is changing. And water, which used to be these key resources that everyone wants to have, cities, largest cities have been built around water, is now becoming a source of great danger. And that is quite interesting. At the same time, Mohammed, you highlighted the fact that water needs a lot of energy in many places in the world. Actually, this is true, and this is increasing due to climate change. For instance, the more you have disruption of rainfall patterns, the more you need to rely on alternative sources of water, including desalination, including retreatment of sewage effluents, including grey water, but also you need sometimes to dig or pump, I shall say, deeper to extract water from deeper underground. At the end of the day, all your sources of water will have a higher electricity, or generally speaking, energy footprint, which is a concern because this is one source of greenhouse gases. So then it fits, again, the problem of the climate crisis. So this is what is called a positive feedback loop, which is not positive at all for us humans. But this is the problem of we have a water crisis, so we need more energy to have alternative sources, but then we emit more greenhouse gases, more climate change, etc. What we need to have, unfortunately, the COP is not really about that, is to have a disruption of these so-called positive feedback loops, because otherwise we will find ourselves in problems where we always put more energy to try to solve the issues of water and the issues of droughts and food insecurity. Now, water, of course, is something that will be part of the discussions, but unfortunately, and this is something we've found across all the COPs, hopefully this will change, it becomes one element of bigger items. So adaptation, mitigation, and so on. And then we speak about a little about water. I believe a much greater role should be given to water, given its centrality in how climate change, again, affects human lives.
Yeah, I agree. I think those of us that are directly or indirectly involved in water issues are going to make that push at this COP28. I certainly will try for those of us that will be there. So hang on to you, Laurent, and I want to shift the conversation to climate justice and climate equity. And I'll pose, yeah, it's a, it's a loaded question. I'll pose that question to you first before others have a chance to jump in. And one thing, you know, Aisha talked about the agenda for the COP this year. One of the other days happens to be one essentially dedicated to relief, recovery, and peace. And, you know, I think early on when the agenda was unveiled, this seemed to be, you know, a nice addition to the agenda or themes. But I think now, considering the current state of ongoing conflicts in the region, not just the current conflict, but even progressively this last year, and the intersection with things like climate migration issues, I think this day gets a little bit more prominence. There may be a bigger spotlight on it now. But in that context, what are some of the climate justice and humanitarian goals that should be a targeted outcome during COP to take care of this opportunity of having this special, unique day dedicated to this topic?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. This is a very important question. Unfortunately, climate justice means a lot of different things to a lot of stakeholders. We have very different understanding of what is climate justice if we look at the perspective of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have a different perspective if we look at what the activists represented, for instance, as part of the youth, will put forward on the agenda. We have a different one if we look at the business community. We have a very different one if we look also at the indigenous communities, which see things in a very specific manner sometimes. I just give you some, an example. Climate justice may mean for the UNFCCC that some countries responsible historically for climate change or climate disruption or climate destruction, the climate crisis, are the ones who should be held responsible to solve the situation. And they are the ones for which the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, for instance, is legally binding in terms of reducing their emissions, meaning they have to make things change and they have to pay for it. They have to implement transformations. For activists, this can be different because they may see that some countries which have no historical responsibilities are now rich enough to be considered as responsible for the pollution that is happening on a continuous basis. So year after year, China, but also South Korea or some other countries, emerging economies, have a carbon footprint which contributes to climate change negatively. So activists will look at that in a tougher manner than the UNFCCC, which would consider that it's just on a voluntary basis. This is what the Paris Agreement on Climate Change basically acknowledges. But for indigenous communities, the difference is not between rich countries and poor countries. It's about communities. And within rich and within poor countries, there are destitute communities which cannot survive the climate crisis. So for instance, if you're in Brazil, you have a very different situation, whether you're in Rio or whether you're in the Amazon, and your ecosystems are totally being transformed and your way of life is totally disappearing. And it's even worse if you're in a small community, indigenous community on remote islands, where your whole ecosystem is disappearing. It's not just transformed, it's disappearing, taken over by the ocean. And for these communities, for instance, there are some in India, they consider that it's not just about difference between rich countries, poor countries, or historical responsibilities. It is about what we do right now to stop the climate crisis. And for some of these communities, for instance, India or China, they have as much responsibility than the US, France, or the UK. So these are very different perspectives. And this is quite difficult sometimes to have this idea of climate justice then being aligned during the negotiations, unfortunately. But going back to your point, what the main items with regards to climate justice will be about, it will be about essentially funding. Funding for first the new loss and damage fund, which has been officially agreed upon during the past negotiations, but which needs still to have a mechanism to be accepted and then funded. So that's one. We need to agree on a mechanism, etc., and it can take years. The other thing is that we need to agree on the climate finance increase, because if we remember, in 2009, it's quite a time ago, 14 years ago, in Copenhagen, the international community agreed on $100 billion of climate finance being made available every year by 2020. And 2020 came, and there was nothing near $100 billion being available. And in addition to that, most of the climate finance is actually loans. And this, in terms of climate justice, is considered by most stakeholders, especially the youth and the indigenous communities, as a new way to bind into poverty some of the most destitute countries and communities in the global south. So there is very much emphasis during these forthcoming negotiations on the climate justice with regards to funding being made available for real and enough and fast enough. So this is what we'll look at, especially during the 2 weeks of negotiations in Dubai.
Thanks. Aisha, please feel free to add on.
Yes, so I would add to Laurent, yes, climate justice would mean different things for different countries, but seeing the word peace on the agenda, that attracted my attention. And I think, and I have been following, Minister Mariam Al-Muhairi, Minister of the Climate Change and Environment in the UAE. She has been, holding different meetings to discuss the climate security. And I think that is stemming from the climate security issues that are, taking place within the Middle East. Now, we spoke about the implications of climate change on the water scarcity, extreme weather events, and all of that. But also, what is also taken, we already see emerging signals of the implication of climate change is the transboundary implications. We already see geopolitical tensions on issues around, for example, sand and dust storms. We see geopolitical tensions around the water security. Take, for example, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And the Middle East region is a home for around 2.4 internal displacement people. But now I think with the Gaza war, that will be the number will be higher. But also a recent study showed that 70,000 people internally displaced because of the natural disaster. So the issue is coming. It started already, but it's also coming. So I think the UAE would want, from the host of COP28, would want also to spot the light on the importance of the climate security. Already the UAE, as a member of the UN Security Council, has pushed for the climate security agenda, but that didn't receive enough attention. I think the idea may be to include the security into the COP negotiations. We will wait and see.
I'm glad you brought up climate security. I was going to pose the parallel of climate justice because, as you said, climate justice, climate equity, sometimes even climate security gets used interchangeably, and different people view that differently. So I'm glad you brought that up as a parallel, because it was also one of the questions related to one of the questions from the audience. Essam, please, yes, of course, jump in.
Yeah. So, Mohammed, from my perspective, climate security as a scientist, not as a policy maker or someone who's working policies, something is very important in it. While it put the responsibility on the nation that produced a lot of the gas of greenhouse, put them that they have to fix it. But we see in developed nations that it relaxes the nations from starting to take action right now. When you put yourself in the victim seat, you say, okay, so I know that climate justice did not ask people to be in the victim seat and to wait, but many nations, including the Middle East, are waiting for this money to start to tackle impact of climate change, which I think is not the best way to do things. The second thing that was come to my mind, the climate justice, it is in the justice to access the data. Okay, the way that European and American Western nations have access to their climate and environmental data, it is not the same as we have it in the Middle East. In the Middle East, you can go to jail for studying a river, an aquifer, for making a publication about the increase of air pollution or the increase in temperature or a forecast model. And so this justice, local justice, need to be there so we can, in the Middle East, contribute to international efforts. And I hope that these are questions that can be brought in the COP28.
That's a good point. Thanks for showing us, kind of taking it down to an even more local distilled level of an issue that's relevant. And data is important because you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So I appreciate you bringing that point. All right, let's shift the conversation to somewhat related, but climate engagement. And again, you know, this is one of those terms that could mean a little bit differently to different people. But one of the criticisms of many of the COP meetings of the past is this idea or feeling of a lack of inclusivity and access to different groups outside of those that are centrally affiliated with the formal agenda or formal parties or even segments of the United Nations or the UNFCCC. But my perspective is that's been changing with time. And certainly I think you can see that there's growing more representation from civil society in youth. But that's not to say that it's perfect. I mean, there's certainly room for improvement in terms of how do we engage and include those groups. And I want to specifically highlight engagement from the Global South, which of course would include the region that we're focused on, the Middle East and North Africa. Even within those groups of civil society and youth and climate activists, in the past, it's been disproportionately represented by the Global North. So the question I pose to you is, what could be some recommended steps to improve and incorporate the participation of these groups? And specifically, I think we can talk broadly, but if you could also talk about representation of those groups from the Global South, from the MENA region. And I shall pose this question to you first.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohammed. It's an important question. Yes, the engagement of the various groups, the youth and the private sector is really important because the top-down, the government role is not enough to act on the climate. And as I mentioned, the UAE host of the COP28 has opened the green zone this year to really involve and engage with these non-state actor groups. So it is free to anyone to join. But I think as a concrete steps for the engagement of the youth, which, constitute a major component of the society in the Middle East, and these who will be, impacted by our climate decisions today and also the implications of climate change in the long run. I think the youth has the right to be educated about the climate change. That said, today also the education about climate change via the social media is also already there, but they have the right to access the right information about climate change. So I think what needs to change is to raise the awareness and to integrate the climate science in the education curricula at different levels, from the school level, university level, and so on. And then also the youth should have the voice also in the policy making. And that also happens through the engagement from, for example, the government to educate them and give them the space to also participate or give their voice on what they want to say about the climate. Speaking from Singapore, at the moment, Singapore, for example, also interested on sending out a delegation of the youth to the COP28, and we, as in the university at the NUS University, we have designed a series of educational lectures on the COP28. Today we had a lecture this afternoon. And so the idea is to educate people on what to look out for if they are attending the COP. So they go there and then they learn, they get the exposure and they learn about, different aspects of the climate action. And of course, the UAE this year also wanted to involve the youth from the Middle East. Also, they have created a platform called the Youth Council for Climate Change under the Majlis al-Shabab al-Arabi. So it has representative of young people from different Middle East countries, and they run also series of educational programs to learn about the impacts of the climate change and also to learn about how the COP negotiations are run. The COP28 itself also has put forward some platforms for the youth. One of them is the Youth Climate Champion. Another one is the International Youth Delegates. And then there's a specific one on the UAE Youth Delegates. Already 100 young people from across the world have been selected to attend the COP this year. So I think, as you mentioned, it is changing now. There is a momentum for the youth engagement, and I will stop there. I wanted to say something, but I forgot.
That's okay. If it comes to you, feel free to interrupt and add it on. On engagement, Laurent, Assam, you unmuted. I think you want to say something.
Yes, so I want to say, as an educator, so as somebody who teach the climate change engagement for youth is perceived.
Sorry, you're cutting in and out. Your connection is a little bit unstable. Can you hear us?
Okay.
Oh. Assam, why don't we do this? Laurent, if you don't mind answering, Assam, maybe if you don't mind resetting your internet, maybe logging back on and on just to see if it'll improve.
Okay.
Perfect. Laurent, we'll let you answer until Assam can come back.
Yes, engagement is very, very important, and it has to be now more of a quality change than a quantity change. Let me explain. Back in the days, at the beginning of the negotiations, which I started following again many years ago, not so many people were following it. It was not so high, on the agenda of especially the youth. And so not so many people knew about it. Not so many people were informed. I remember, by the way, for you to really understand how segregated information was in Copenhagen, which I mentioned earlier on. I remember because this was one of the first big climate conference. And there, when I remember one morning to go into the UN side where I was an observer from my university at that time, I entered, and I remember seeing on the side of the pathway for negotiators and observers, they were some people chanting, sign the deal, sign the deal, sign the deal. And I was remembering, and I remember that we were entering into the building, this was second week, but there was no deal to be signed. We had never come, close to signing a deal. But the people outside thought, they just need to agree and sign the deal. But there was a lot of confusion. So now, 15 years almost after, the general understanding of climate negotiations is much better, although it still is very complex, probably the single most complex piece of negotiations in the world. The most complex, not necessarily the hardest, which might be the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but at least the most complex. And what is very important is that now we have a lot of people following, but yet we need to have still this quality improvement in terms of the general knowledge about the climate crisis, the science, and on the other hand, the negotiations and the policy side, because the two are extremely important and they go hand in hand. And we can be really good in one, but if we don't have the other, we'll be penalized. We can make a contribution, but it can only go so far. And we need to have people in the communities who follow and who try to make pressure so that there are greater ambitions to fight climate change, that they really learn more to be able to make, to make their lobbying the most precise, the most relevant as possible. Because, and I finish with this, but I think it's super important. I work in a department of public policy, and we know really well how lobbying works. If your member of parliament or key decision maker receives an email which says, do something for climate change, but there is really not anything said, he will understand people are concerned about that, so he needs to speak about it. However, if he receives a bunch of emails saying you should stop the subsidies to, let's say, coal or tar sands, which are extremely polluting, he will have a different approach. He will not just speak about it, but he will have to pay attention to the way he positions himself in these complex negotiations. And he will know that he has probably to do something with regards to these specific agenda items, because it's very easy for a decision maker to say, I'm totally against climate change, and then do almost nothing about it. Greenwashing is everywhere now. There are some companies, by the way, whose business is about greenwashing, and we have to be very careful about that. So this is why we need to improve the quality of the general knowledge of everyone, actually, so that the pressure on decision makers can be stronger, and where the negotiations are not hijacked by interest groups.
Sam, you're back. We hopefully the connection is better.
No, I totally agree with you, and I've seen this in the water sector interest group, the lobbying, the way that people will write 100 emails to policymakers to make them interest, to show that dams are good. Let's make bigger dams. Dams that we will not construct in the United States are being sold everywhere in Africa because they are more lucrative. So I hear you, and I think my comment on how climate change is perceived on the average human being in the Middle East, it is perceived as an elite question. It needs to be an everybody question. People who go to the COP are perceived like the fancy elite who went to very good schools, and they have the luxury actually to discuss it. While those who pay the price of climate change are those who are way in the low scale of the economic distribution of our society. So what we need to make, that we need to remind people that climate change is part of our identity in the Middle East. It is part of our story. It's part of who we are. And it's not just a discussion of a scenario in the future. And so the knowledge of climate change, I mean, you can't be somebody. So I can say that I'm born in Libya and I'm Egyptian. I can say if I'm Egyptian, if I don't know nothing about the Nile. I can say that I'm from the Gulf region if I know nothing about the storms or the coastal retreat, because it has shaped the map of the Gulf region. So I agree with Aisha. when she mentioned we really need to go deep into the school. And I'm very happy to hear that UAE has made COP28, the green zone, open to everybody. This is marvelous. This is the first time it happened. So I'm hoping this will allow more people to jump in the green zone and get to know how the climate is basically impacting many things in their life.
I love that idea of, if I can infer from your words, maybe to call it something else, is I think the history of the region has been about adaptation. We've had to adapt for centuries. We may not have called it climate change. We may not have, just historically, people that have lived in this region, in the Middle East, North Africa region, have historically adapted to changes that maybe now we refer to as climate change, in terms of aridity, of drought, how we get our water, how we get our livelihood, how we consume food, how we have adapted to incorporating energy. And so I really like that idea, and I think that resonates. I like you guys mentioned the green zone. I'll just make a technical point for our audience. I think it was earlier today or yesterday, the COP28 website opened up. Yes, the green zone is open for all, but I think you need to get tickets. They're free. That has been posted yesterday. So for those of you that will be at COP28, that is available. If you go to the COP28 website, make sure to secure tickets for the particular days that you'll be going. I'll shift to our last formal question. And this is very centric to the COP itself. And I'll put it under the umbrella of climate policy, which is one of the things that are a hallmark of the COP meetings, certainly definitely at least since the pandemic, the last two COPs, is the meetings, the negotiations have ended on some type of development that aims to make progress on global climate policy, or some deal, right? So COP26, there was negotiations that ran overtime and led to the Glasgow Pact. We can debate and argue whether that was of value or not. From my expression, you can probably guess what I feel about that. Then COP27 led to the loss and damage agreement, which I think most will agree was a lot more substantial than the Glasgow Pact. So with that in mind, what is a potential realizable, it can be at one end achievable, on the other end maybe ambitious, an outcome out of COP28 negotiations that can move the global climate agenda forward, much like how the previous COPs have done with the Glasgow Pact, which, to my personal opinion, was not really advancement at all.
It was a fraud.
Sorry?
It was a fraud. It was a failure.
I tried to be nice, but yeah, we can call it that. Versus, COP27, the loss and damage, which, it's still, moving forward. I think there were some discussions on it, the pre-COP28, it got punted to the World Bank. But anyhow, these were things that are meant to move it to the next level. What do you see could happen at COP28 that can move these climate negotiations to the next level? And Laurent, if you want to take the first cut on that.
Okay, thank you. I just would like to continue about that. Unfortunately, there is a pattern now for a dozen years that each and every COP will end up with a document that will be branded as something which is a big success for the community. And this is just a way for the host country to say, oh, we've been a big success. But let's be careful, because it's not. And sometimes it's a real failure. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. The second one is that about loss and damage, let's be very careful. What was the achievement last year is that the Global South obtained a new fund. This is what they wanted for loss and damage. But loss and damage has been spoken about for many years, since negotiations in Warsaw, actually. So way back. But now what we can have is money being put there for loss and damage specifically, which is something that for a long time the Global North didn't want to hear about, because they knew that they would have to compensate countries for the climate crisis they're responsible for. Now, where I would like to say we have to be very careful is that it's not new. to obtain promises during climate negotiations, and everyone's happy, but then the money doesn't come. Let's remember, we spoke earlier on about, 2009, $100 billion being promised by 2020, and then 2020, 2021, up to till today, we don't have this 100 billion per year, and most of them are debt, which used to be, by the way, already existing, but these were debts for development under another name. And this is exactly what we need to avoid in this COP. There is a lot of potential, and especially for the loss and damage fund. But what we don't need is that money for bilateral or multilateral aid to be just change of name and goes to so-called loss and damage. But this was money which was going anyways to some countries. Let's say the UK every year, or the US or France will spend money to help, I don't know, Sri Lanka or Nigeria. And then they call this money now, they call it loss and damage compensations for whatever can happen there. We have to be careful. And so this is one of the key things, because if we're careful, if there is additional mechanisms for climate finance, which are put online, then this is a big success. This is a big success because keep in mind, in the Global South, there is very limited insurance coverage. So when you have a cyclone or major flood, as we saw in Pakistan, or landslides due to different rainfall patterns, then these people could obtain a compensation. And that is super important. So this, I think, is what could make the difference for the Global South, especially. Then I'll leave the colleagues to keep on developing.
Sure. Aisha or Assam, do you want to tackle your perspective on what could be the big outcome out of COP28?
Let's start with Aisha.
Thank you, Assam. Right. So a big outcome, well, it's a hope, let's say. But I think a big focus on the COP28 will be to ensure the success on the outcomes of the first global stocktake. This is something that both the Global South and Global North are interested in achieving, is to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. And that said, also building on what Laurent has mentioned, the COPs now end with a cover decision, a document which discuss different aspects. And if we look at the previous COPs, they make success on some aspect and then not much of a progress on other aspects. I expect that the UAE would make a progress on the operationalization of the loss and damage, because already the UAE has hosted meetings. The Transitional Committee on the Loss and Damage has hosted meetings on identifying where the fund will be based. There was a tension already when the World Bank was suggested as the host of the fund. But last week in Abu Dhabi, an agreement has been reached for the World Bank to host the fund on an interim basis for 4 years until the countries figure out another location for the fund and how that fund will be operationalized. Another area the UAE wants to, showcase a progress on is on the finance. So already, if someone is following the statements that comes from the UAE COP committee, there is an intention to, build trust on the finance and mobilize the $100 billion US dollars, but also to make a progress on the negotiations around the new climate finance goal, which should be established by 2024. So apart from that, I think also another area that I am hoping to see progress on is the language on the fossil fuels. So the unabated, the phase down of unabated Coal has been adopted for the first time at COP26. Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 maintained the same language. And this year, the G20 meeting ended with, a communique which maintained the same language as, COP27 and 6. This is going to be a challenge task for the UAE, but because of the release of the synthesis report on the global stocktake, which emphasized the importance of phasing out fossil fuels to keep the 1.5 within reach, I am expecting a change in the language from the UAE this year. But what exactly the language, this is something to look out for.
Yeah, a lot to look forward to. Assam?
My hope that the COP28 will start the discussion in the Middle East, especially in the hyper-arid nation in the Arab world, to have the nations in the Arab world to commit a fraction of their GDP for climate and water research. And this is very important. We can't understand the problem. We don't have data or observation. And from being in this field, I can tell you from east to west, all the centers for climate research and for water research are understaffed, underfunded, and we need to resolve that drastically, because we have an outflow of people working on climate and water research from our area to other places. This is include myself and other people who finally will have to abandon to study the climate change in our area and water study in our area, because it is the resources are not there, and we just want these resources to be equivalent to what exists in other fields, like in cybersecurity, in medicine, in media, in political research. Water research and climate research is by default way below, with one order of magnitude, the funding existing for other fields. And I hope it can take a decision to change this and to protect the people working on this field also, because many people are afraid to make a publication with a model that will show that temperature will locally increase in this area or water will be shorter in that area because of the repression that will be on them. And finally, I mean, like I was saying, simply my case, it's easier to work on water on Mars, which is what I do, okay, than to work on the water of my own country where I was born. And publishing a paper about water on Mars, put Science and Nature, and get you to have a house in Los Angeles. Publishing the same paper on water on Egypt, put you in exile for 10 years out of the country.
And to be fair, Los Angeles is nice, so we're not holding that against you.
Yes.
But I like that point of we need more funding and support for research, and I'll even add on development in our part of the world. And if I can add to that idea, Assam, I think, and you touched on it a little bit, which is right now, speaking to the youth and those that are engaged in this, a lot of the youth efforts is towards activism right now, which I think is appropriate to get to where we need to go in terms of addressing the climate crisis, certainly in our region. But when we get to a point where we need to put solutions to the ground, we need people that have that skill set and expertise. So I encourage our youth to continue to do activism, but shift your careers into those that are in the STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, because those are the careers we're going to need in the near future, unfortunately, not the far future, in the very near future, to put action and, to take plans into action and implement the things we need to do to begin to adapt and mitigate to climate. So with that, I think we can put a close to our discussion. I really, really appreciated your thoughts and words and wisdom. I thought this was very well done and received. And I'll also point again that this session has been recorded, and as soon as we conclude, it will be available on YouTube, and I will, share it with all of you, and feel free to share it with others. And I think this is a good way for us to sort of look ahead to COP28, and hopefully I see you all at COP28, and those of us that are tuning in, please, if you see us, come talk to us. I'm sure we'll be around. And thank you all very much, Laurent, Aisha, and Assam for your contribution. And we'll more to come, certainly post COP28.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you.